Welcome, greetings, salutations, live from London. I came here to be with the Queen. She invited me over, and I'm using Keynote, the live view in here. This is actually kind of cool. So I just wanted to bring it up because Tom Bridge showed me how to do this, and so that's why you're seeing me a couple of times. And I can actually adjust my hair now in my own slide, which I think is fantastic. So I can make sure that I'm looking good here and able to do this. So welcome MacDevOpsYVR22. We got a great 34 minutes and 22 seconds where we're going to talk about SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, take some questions. I've got the Discord chat going here. Ooh, it's inception. So if you've got questions as we go through here, we'll be able to answer them, and we'll kind of do this live and all the rest. So without further ado, modern authentication for modern world. I think this came out of a conversation I had with Matt. Once we got done talking about waffles and the benefits of veganism, we decided to talk about modern security practices. And we got into some sidelines around SAML versus OpenID Connect and the differences and what was better and what wasn't. So we thought it would be fantastic if we could have a session that kind of dived into both of those a little bit more. With that, Joel, that's me. Yee. Now at Jump Cloud, previously other stuff. Maybe you're using software I wrote. If you are, fantastic. If not, I guess I got to keep writing and figure something out. So with that, first of all, before we really get into the difference between SAML and OAuth, they all kind of follow a very basic flow. And you might hear this referred to as a three-legged SAML flow or a three-legged authentication flow. So we're going to map that out, and then we're getting into specifics around SAML and then OAuth a little bit, and OpenID Connect. Then we're going to do some demos, and then we're going to show you how you can kind of do some cool stuff and play around with this on your own if you want to. So basic flow, SAML and OpenID Connect, you've got kind of three pieces here. You've got an identity provider. So this would be Okta, Jump Cloud, Azure, whatever's going to have your username and password. You've got a service provider. This would be Salesforce, Slack, something that wants to use that authentication and do something with it. And then down at the bottom, that's where you've got your laptop, right? So three kind of basic things: identity provider, service provider, laptop. These will make up three-legged flows. So you want to go log into Slack. So you go log in, it takes you to a login page. That login page has most likely been a redirect, right? So you go to Slack, you click the login button, then you see your Azure, Okta, Jump Cloud, whatever sign in. That's because you've been redirected. So Slack will send you a 302. That 302 has a whole bunch of stuff in it. If it's SAML, it's going to have a SAML assertion in it. If it's not SAML, if it's just OpenID Connect, you're going to have a lot of query parameters in there. So that sends you down to the laptop, and that redirects your browser back to the identity provider, which is going to have some stuff there, like a SAML assertion or some OpenID Connect parameters in the URL. And that's going to cause the identity provider to generate a whole bunch of HTML. That HTML renders in your browser, allows you to see maybe where to put your username, where to put your password. Any of that interaction pieces is all done. That's being hosted by your identity provider. It's not being hosted by the service provider, right? So that's the beauty of this, is that Slack has no knowledge whatsoever of your username and password. You're not even directly interacting with Slack. Instead, you're all going through the identity provider on the other side there. Good stuff, and how kind of the magic happens here. So identity provider sends down a bunch of HTML. You do whatever it is that you do to authenticate yourself to your identity provider. Gaze longingly into a device, put your finger on something, maybe type in a password, maybe accept a push. That's between you and your identity provider and has nothing to do with SAML or OpenID Connect, because both of those only handle what happens around the authentication. So in that case, your identity provider then ideally identifies you, says you're the right person, and it will send back another redirect. So this is another 302. if it's SAML, it'll have a SAML assertion in it. We'll show you some assertions in a little bit. If it's OpenID Connect, there's a couple of OpenID Connect flows, but this will typically have a code. So some sort of random string that's going to be used to check back in with the identity provider and pick up some tokens. All right. So again, you get redirected. That comes down from the identity provider and sends you back to the service provider. In which case, if you're using SAML, the service provider can just ingest that SAML assertion. It's a bunch of XML that's then been signed by a specific certificate. If that all validates out correctly, the service provider will say you're authenticated and will let you in. If it's OpenID Connect, that's going to be a code. And that code will then allow the service provider to connect back directly to the identity provider. So not going through back through your browser or anything like that. So that way it's got a little bit more security, a little bit more validation that it's talking to the actual thing it's expecting to. It sends the code back to the identity provider, and the identity provider then sends it a set of tokens, right? And that kind of completes OpenID Connect. Now, this is incredibly an oversimplification of all of these pieces. So keep in mind, there's lots and lots of knobs and other things to twist in all of these, especially with SAML, but this is kind of the basic concept here. And the big thing to take away from this is when you're using modern authentication like SAML or OpenID Connect, the service provider isn't actually ingesting your password. It's not actually authenticating you. Instead, it's redirecting your browser back to the identity provider. The identity provider is then doing all of the work, redirecting you back with some sort of token code that's then going to be used by the service provider to validate that you are who you are. Now, if you're a Mac admin, you've been doing this job for a little while, and you've ever had to deal with Active Directory, you've probably done some work with Kerberos, in which case you might be looking at this and saying, this looks very similar to a Kerberos flow where you might be using a service ticket, right? Instead of, if you want to go to a printer, because that's what you do with Kerberos, right? You go to printers. So you want to print something to a printer. You don't actually send it a username and password. You would instead use your TGT, your ticket granting ticket, to go back to your KDC, which is a lot like an identity provider. Your identity provider would give you a service ticket that would be specific to that service, and then you would send that service ticket over to the printer. So this flow is almost identical to what's been being done for many, many years with Kerberos and other authentication schemes like that. So all in here. So I wanted to give you an idea. So now let's get into the actual specifics about some of these things. SAML, security assertion markup language. I'll tell you right now, I don't like SAML. I mean, it's secure, it's fine. It does its job, but it is incredibly complicated to work with. Lots of little knobs and things to tweak. And so setting up SAML integrations can sometimes be really laborious. And even better when you don't get it right. It's really hard to troubleshoot. So I'll show you some things about how it works, and then I'll show you some stuff in the demo, and then I'll show you some tools that you might be able to use to get some of that information a little bit better there. So this is a SAML request. You can see it's really old. I think this is one of the generic ones Microsoft uses in some of their training materials. So a SAML request is XML. You probably won't see it as this because it's going to be base 64 encoded, and then it's going to be signed. So you'll have a big signature blob in here. But at the end of the day, it is XML with a series of tags and then values for those tags. Everything is very, very wordy. You can see these are all URN, OASIS, names, TC, SAML 2.0, metadata, ID, right? So an awful lot of stuff is packed into this assertion. This assertion, after it's been signed, that's effectively your Kerberos ticket or your opportunity to get into that service and be able to do this here. All right, a couple of things on SAML, and we're crushed you're not here with us either, Tom. So, yeah, or with me in London. Both places would have been fine. All right. SAML requires certificates. That's one of the things that's a little bit harder as we go through this flow. You've got to have certificates set up. You got to have certificates for the identity provider to sign these assertions. And in most cases, you want to have a certificate on the service provider so you can sign that it's actually requesting some of this information. So that's some of the stuff that makes it harder to use, lots of knobs. The certificates does make SAML really hard to use for mobile applications or desktop apps. With a mobile or a desktop app, or just using the browser, you typically have to have one of those private keys from the certificates in that app. And if it's in that app, that means it's not very secure, that you've got all kinds of opportunities for somebody to reverse engineer the binary or somehow steal that private key out of there. All of those are bad things. You don't want that to happen. So that's why SAML is not used very commonly with mobile apps or desktop apps. Very good for web pages, especially when the server can be secured, can be put somewhere, it can do all that. Other things about SAML, it's kind of hard to transfer. It's not really designed to be, do that three-legged auth and then take it someplace else. Whereas OpenID Connect has an ID token that you can really kind of think of as being a standalone signed user record that you can then share with other things, right? So a couple of things about SAML, very widely supported. Lots of places do SAML. You'll see it pretty much any identity provider has it. It's been around a little bit longer than OpenID Connect. Was kind of the real enterprisey way of doing authentication for a number of years. So that's good. Kind of poorly understood. Not a lot of people really know the nuts and bolts of SAML, how it works. It is very hard to troubleshoot. Also means it very hard to implement as we go through there. Handy web pages. When you do need to do some work with SAML and do some of that functionality, samltool.io, I believe that's from OAUTH0, will decode all of those assertions. So it'll break down from the base 64, turn it into usable XML for you, and then also validate signatures and things like that. Also, samltool.com. That, I believe, is hosted by OneLogin. Also, another good set of tools. Pretty much does the same thing as samltool.io. And then you're most likely going to need a web extension for this in some form. At case, you need something to get your SAML traffic out of the web browser. So there's a couple of web extensions that you can get that will do that. And then they'll give you the base assertions that you can then plug into some of these other tools. And so that's a good way of kind of looking at it. I'm going to show you some of that traffic here in a little bit as we go through there. OAuth. OAuth started at Twitter, was a way of kind of sharing authorization. The lines get very blurry when we talk about authentication and authorization, especially within the realm of SAML and OpenID Connect, because there's a lot of layers in each of them. But the goal behind OAuth was the fact that you would get a token, a bearer token, what you're used to, just a random string of letters in most cases, letters and numbers. And that would be your authorization. You would go get this bearer token from something, that thing that gave you the bearer token, that would be the one that did all the authentication. Once you had this bearer token, you could send it off to a service. The service wouldn't have to authenticate you anymore because the bearer token was being used as authorization. And so that's, in a nutshell, what OAuth is. It's just this concept of having a token, and that token allows you to do things. From there, things got a lot more complicated. So if you take one thing away from this, because really it's the only thing you have to know about OAuth, OAuth equals bearer token, all right? So since bearer tokens by themselves weren't exceptionally functional, there's a lot of exercise for the reader to be able to figure out how to authenticate, how to move these things, and how to go and use them in a coherent manner. That's where OpenID Connect came in. And OpenID Connect was very focused on putting an authentication framework around OAuth and giving it a little bit more functionality, maybe intent with how you use it. So instead of the OAuth protocol or OAuth documentation itself being very, very open, OpenID Connect kind of solidifies the thinking into a few things. All right, big takeaways from OpenID Connect. Authentication layer for OAuth, they kind of work hand in glove. In theory, you could probably use OpenID Connect without OAuth, but it'd get really weird. And OAuth without OpenID Connect is used quite a bit, but not so much for public-facing or customer-facing things. You may be using OAuth all over your internal stack, just as tokens are being sent around, but OpenID Connect would then give that authentication layer on top of it. And typically you get a full token set out of an OpenID Connect flow. And so that's 3 tokens. It's an access token, Access token is what you would think of as a traditional bearer token. Short, ephemeral, should only be good for 5 minutes or something like that. And that gives you access to a specific service or something along those lines. An ID token, this will be a full user record that you can get out of there, signed by the identity provider, so you can do some work there. And then a refresh token. And a refresh token is kind of like an access token in that it allows you to go get a new access token. So where access tokens may have only a 1 to 5 minute window, a refresh token can be good for 90 days or maybe forever. And what this allows you to do is you would sign in through OpenID Connect, get all the tokens, keep the refresh and the access token locally somewhere safe, use the access token. Once that expires or once it's been used, you would then use the refresh token to get a new access and refresh token. The goal of all this is every token is only used once. Once the token is actually used, it's burned, right? So you have an access token, you can use that. Some places allow you to use it for until it expires, just to keep the traffic down. But once that access token is expired, use your refresh token to get a new access token. That gives you a brand new access token and a brand new refresh token. At that point, the old refresh token is useless. It's been expired, it's been burned. The old access tokens are useless as well. And then you kind of start the whole process over. And so in this case, if your communications ever got compromised, everything's fine, because as soon as you've used these tokens, they're used, right? Very highly configurable about what gets into the tokens. We'll show you that in a little bit. Here's an access token. It's just random numbers, right? This is an opaque access token, so it doesn't actually have any meaning itself. You will see some identity providers like Azure that give you a non-opaque access token that's actually a JWT, JSON web token with some information. Here's an ID token. ID tokens are broken up into 3 chunks. The blue at top is a header that says what keys were used to sign this token. The green in the middle, that's the actual meat of the token and the access token. And then the pink down at the bottom, that's the signature block for this. And if you were to decode this, you'd get something like this, which is a very basic access token or ID token with a couple of information about you, an email, some other things like that in there, an issuer, and member of, maybe what groups you might be a member of. It's a refresh token. Refresh tokens, again, are typically opaque, so you don't even know what they are. And a couple of handy web pages for you, jwt.io and jwt.ms. They will both decode tokens for you, so you don't have to do a lot of that on yourself. Cool. And I see that these are being added into the Slack already, or not Slack, the Discord, so fantastic. You don't even have to type this in. All right, let's do a demo. All right, I'll go here real quick, and I've got my handy dandy tool that allows me to show all of the parts of a flow with OpenID Connect here. So we're going to go down and we're going to grab Azure, and we're just going to load this up, and we're going to have Azure in here. We can see we started the OpenID Connect flow. We logged into Microsoft Online, and that then sent me someplace else. Added a bunch of this. We got some challenges. And here I'm going to go through and I'm going to go me at pdu.dev and I heart vegan waffles 21 bang. And there we go. I'm not going to protect my account because I'm a badger. And here's a token set. So we've got an access token. We've got an ID token. Here's the ID token actually decoded with a bunch of the pieces. And I didn't ask for a refresh token, so it didn't give me one. If I want to, I can go up and hit decode here, and that will take you to jwt.io, and you can actually see this token fully decoded and put in there. So you're going to take a quick look at that. A couple other things that have happened in here. If I go back to my logs, you can see that I got bounced around a couple of places. There's a bunch of challenges in there for certificates. There's a form post in here. Fun thing about Azure is that it actually takes your username and password and it becomes a form post and it puts it in here. So somewhere in this mess, you should see I heart vegan waffles. There we go. I heart vegan waffles 21. All right. So fun thing about Azure, you can see that as you go through this. Some provisional navigations where it takes you back, puts a bunch of stuff in it, get redirected again. Now that redirect is how the OpenID Connect flow finishes. And then you've got all the tokens in here. If you're going to do something that has SAML, I've got another little fun flow that's in here. We're going to load up. and I'm just going to sign in with the username and password. And I've actually linked OpenID Connect to a SAML authentication because you can fully chain these if you want. And here you can see we started a provisional navigation to our OpenID Connect service, had a couple of challenges, got a redirect to a SAML service. That SAML service then went through, it really wants a client certificate from me, but I won't give it one. Then it redirects to a login. Then you get another redirect back to the OpenID token service. So a whole lot of things go back and forth here as these pieces get created. So it's not at all crazy uncommon to have quite a few hops happening as you're doing a full-on OpenID Connect flow. Here's kind of another quick example. If I clear this log and sign in as another user, dev, I heart vegan waffles, and sign in provisional. And here you can actually see, since I am chaining an OpenID Connect flow to a SAML flow, just because why not? You're cool and fun and you can do that. Plus, I wanted to actually show you a SAML response without having to build a app that did SAML authentication. So this is an actual SAML post. This is effectively my app saying, hey, identity provider, Jump Cloud, please authenticate this user. Here's all this stuff around it. Here's a signature block on there. It is just a ginormous amount of things that you have to deal with, and it's just not much fun to be able to do it. And just to prove, since we've got it in here, we've got an Okta authentication that we can do, and it'll be the almost exact same thing. Come in here with a username. Let's use this one. And a password. I heart vegan waffles 21. There we go. And we get a bunch of tokens again. So you can see OpenID Connect is a really good way of interacting with a variety of different identity providers that allow you to do this, and some really great stuff on here. All right. With that, a little bit of a demo. Let's hop back into the slides. We have 8 minutes and 12 seconds left. So playing with tokens. If you want to get more engaged in this, you can use, I was actually using a copy of some open source software called ORI-Hydra, sorry, getting late over here. It only does tokens, doesn't do any authentication whatsoever, but it's very easily Dockerized with a medium amount of knobs on it. Open source, written in Go. I'm really liking Go. I like Go a lot better than Python. I still find Swift much more conversant for me and easier to work, but Go is pretty nice for doing web services and things like that. So Ori Hydra is written entirely in Go. Should be pretty easy to set up without too much effort, and allow you to do a lot of just kind of token or OpenID Connect flows. You can set up your own authentication schemes. In fact, with a little bit of work, you could have it authenticating you back to SAML, authenticating you back to an OpenID Connect upstream provider, or doing some other cool things. So if you have any interest in playing around, ORY.sh, they do have a couple of other services there. They're trying to break into a commercial offering, I believe. So if you have any interest, take a look at that. I would heavily encourage you as a great place to go to just start poking around with some of these things. Or if you wanted to bring OpenID Connect or to some degree OAuth directly into your environment, this would be one of the first places that I would suggest you go. Second place, if you're doing any sort of Swift applications, Tim Perfect showed off a cool app that he's done recently called Xcreds. That allows you to do some synchronization of your local Mac password back up to an OpenID Connect provider. And Tim is using OpenID Connect Lite, OIDC Lite. Lite is in the beer, not as in what lights your way. Well, maybe Miller Lite lights your way. That's probably bad. Anyway, OpenID Connect Lite. It's a library I put together for Swift. I've got it on GitLab and I've got it on GitHub. I think GitLab is slightly ahead of GitHub, but I'll fix that and probably just put it all in GitHub because nobody else likes the Fox like I like the Fox. The Swift package for doing OpenID Connect authentication flows works with AS Web Authentication Session. So really, really nice way of doing it if you're on iOS. If you're on the Mac, you may want to use it with a web view, so it'll support that as well. And it'll handle all of the OpenID Connect pieces for you as you go through that. So a couple of things to leave you with. SAML is XML, OpenID Connect is base 64 URL encoded. SAML is meh, but OpenID Connect is great. And so with that, we have a few minutes left. But first, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to JD. Thank you to Felipe. It's great. Love doing this conference. Looking forward to when we can meet again in person and do this in Vancouver and all have vegan waffles together. I really, really enjoy MacDevOps. It's one of the better conferences that are out there. So I'm glad it's still going and still working. So thank you to all the crew and everybody that's put this together, and Ashton for doing all the graphics and other cool stuff there as well. So thanks everybody for listening. And then don't forget to like and subscribe. I think you're supposed to say that when you're on YouTube, right? Contractually obligated.